If a man and a woman find out that they are in an unscriptural marriage, must they divorce and separate in order to be pleasing to God, or can they remain together? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of Answering the Error. Hi, I'm Don Blackwell, and I am the host of Answering the Error. This is Aaron Gallagher. He is the co-host of Answering the Error, and we've been doing this program for several years, but we're going to do something that's a little bit different today, and that is we have some guests with us. And so I want to begin and introduce you to our guest host today. First, we have Dr. Dave Miller. Dave is with Apologetics Press. Dave has a PhD. Dave has been preaching for many years. He has written a number of books, and he also is a man that we have great respect for, and we're very honored to have you with us on the program today, Dave.
Thank you, Don. Very kind.
We also have Dr. Kerry Duke, and Kerry is also a man we hold in very high esteem. Kerry has written a number of books. He has worked for years with Tennessee Bible College, and we believe he's particularly qualified for the program we're going to be discussing today, and that is the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, because Tennessee Bible College was kind of at the forefront of this battle for many years.
Right.
And so Kerry is a great one to have, and Kerry, we're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Don.
Now, I want to introduce this before we get into the topic of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And that is, we want to simply state what the Bible says about this. So we're going to begin in one of the prime passages, Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9. Jesus said, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." In this passage, Jesus teaches that there is one reason that a man may divorce his wife and remarry with God's approval, and that is fornication. That is marital unfaithfulness. She cheats on him. Furthermore, he says that if a man divorces his wife and it is not for fornication and he remarries, he is committing adultery. And if someone marries his wife that has been put away not for fornication, his wife is committing adultery, and the one that marries her is also committing adultery. This has been the understanding in churches of Christ. As long as I know, it's been the understanding because it's what the Bible teaches. We take it for what it says in a straightforward manner. But this is tough. This is a very powerful teaching from Jesus, and his disciples also found this to be a very tough and stringent saying, as we notice from their reaction in verse number 10. Now, because of this, a lot of people have found themselves in unscriptural marriages. And over the generations, people have come up with all sorts of workarounds to try to escape the force of what Jesus is saying in this passage. We're going to be talking about one of these, what we believe is an error relating to the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage in the program today. Now, Aaron, I'm going to get you to introduce this particular error to us and give us the background of this.
Sure. So we did an episode of Answering the Error on marriage, divorce, remarriage a few weeks ago, I believe. Somebody submitted a video to us, and so we responded. And we really addressed a lot of the arguments made by this individual. I don't even remember the name of the original video that we responded to. And we had an individual that, I like Mike Highsaw. I like him a lot as far as he's a kind man. He makes good arguments. He doesn't make it personal. And so anyway, Mike had done a response video. He reached out to us, and he basically said, "Hey, were you addressing one of my points?" And I said, with Matthew 19, we weren't really responding to you. We were responding to, other arguments, the Waldron-Hicks debate from the 70s, etc. And I said, but when it came to Matthew 5:32, we were addressing one of the arguments that you made there. And so we discussed it back and forth, and he asked for me to send him a list of the Greek grammars that we referred to. We said there's a lot of Greek grammars that said this particular point, and so then he actually looked at those Greek grammars and came and I sat down with him, and his son Jake was there, and we really just discussed this. So he was respectful. I appreciate that, and we basically said that we disagree on the arguments. I told Mike, I was afraid he was encouraging people to stay in adulterous relationships, and then I thought that was a big deal. Mm-hmm. And he likewise said, well, I believe you're encouraging people to to break up marriages that God would not want them to, and he thought that was a big deal. And so we definitely disagree based on the arguments, and he did a response video sort of calling us out, saying these are the arguments they made, and we don't think these arguments are right. And so that's what we wanted to do today, is to just respectfully say, hey, look, these are the arguments that have been made against us, and we want to respond to them. And so we wanted to have some qualified guests. I think Kerry's probably been teaching Greek longer than I've been alive. So no offense, that's a compliment.
That's probably true.
Yeah. Two things I do want to point out. Whenever we deal with the person's video on answering the error, we always reach out to that person personally, and we've done that. Aaron sat down and he's talked with Mike, and I also have called Mike. I've talked to him. We've texted back and forth. The second thing is the reason we're dealing with this is biblical error that can cost a person their soul eternally. This is a very serious thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing a program and spending the time on this. And so it's the seriousness of the matter that it can cost a person their eternal souls. That's the reason for the program. Aaron, we've got the first clip where Mike represents his view, right?
That's great. Yeah.
All right. Why don't we play that now?
Okay.
I don't believe that there has ever been a divorce without sin. And I believe that many remarriages which have occurred after divorces also involve sin, because Jesus said, whoever divorces his wife, except it be for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Now the question is, what is the nature of that adultery in Jesus' teaching? Many believe that what's meant is anytime someone unscripturally divorces and unscripturally remarries, then each time that remarried couple comes together in sex, adultery is committed. And so these people believe that the adultery is ongoing throughout the duration of that remarriage. I, on the other hand, believe that what Jesus is saying is that whenever someone unscripturally divorces their mate and unscripturally remarries another person, in those acts, that unscriptural divorce and unscriptural remarriage, adultery is committed. And so I believe the adultery to be point action.
Now, this viewpoint or this discussion about marriage divorce is not new. In fact, there's a lot of history even in the Lord's church with regard to this. I want to begin, and Kerry, can you tell us a little bit about the background? And because you were at the forefront of this, and several of your instructors even. Yeah, tell us the background of this.
Sure. If I could go back to the 1800s and then just work my way up, I'll try to do this as concisely as possible. The issue of divorce and remarriage was not anywhere near as common in the 1800s as it was in the 1900s or as it is in this century. You had some articles by McGarvey, by Campbell, by Lipscomb and other people, but there just weren't as many divorces. People had to stay together to survive, really, to keep from starving. In the year 1900, as the century changed, only 1 out of every 1,000 people was divorced in this country. So as you work on up to the 1920s, we survived World War I, the Spanish flu, and anytime you have a war, there are profound psychological, cultural, sociological, and family changes that occur. And so you had the Roaring Twenties. In other words, we're past the hard times, we're going to party now. And it was interesting in that time of some real changes in immorality, because people were more public with it, the dress code changed, dancing was more common, and sexual sin was more common. There's an interesting book entitled Only Yesterday by Frederick Lewis Allen. And in chapter 5 of that book, he talks about the revolution in morals and customs. And he talks about all these things. And he attributes the immorality rising in that period to two things, especially. Number one, the automobile, which they referred to as a rolling bedroom. Mm-hmm. And then birth control was becoming more and more common. Mm-hmm. So what happened in the 1920s, I noticed, is that G.C. Brewer had a debate with Judge Lindsay on what was called companionate marriage. And Judge Lindsay wanted the government to stay out of marriage. He wanted people just to be able to move in together and stay together at will, and then to depart at will. It was interesting. That was the first debate that I remember that happening. The 1930s come along, and you've got the Great Depression. People are basically coming back to God, I think, in a sense there because of what happened. The 1940s, of course, was a period of war again. When the first generation of my generation, the baby boomers, came on the scenes as adults in the 1960s, I like to say it this way, Dave, our generation threw a fit, and we've never gotten over that. We've never recovered from that. And so that's when the theme of sex, drugs, and rock and roll really shook this country down to its foundations. Then you had the sexual revolution in the 1970s. And it's interesting, you had the ERA. It's fascinating to me that in 1974, an article in the Yale Journal of Law said that if the Equal Rights Amendment passes, the legal implication will be the legalization of same-sex marriage. 1974. I'm just building up to the marriage, divorce, and remarriage issue here. So you had all that going on. In the meantime, in the late 40s, the early 50s, you had the Kinsey sex reports. And then you had Hugh Hefner to come along. You had the relaxation of standards in movies, which was called the Hays Code. And that was beginning to be just thrown out the window. So everything is getting more and more immoral. And so as this happens, the divorce rate climbs. And in 1980, it peaks at 1 out of every 2 marriages. Now, before, brethren had talked about divorce and remarriage, but it really was not as pressing an issue because there weren't that many. And so what we find then is that in the 1920s, G.C. Brewer had this debate. In 1954, Thomas Warren had a debate with E.C. Fuqua on the people to whom or over whom Matthew 19:9 applies. In other words, E.C. Fuqua said that if you're not a Christian, Matthew 19:9 doesn't apply to you. Now, that's in 1954. So all this is building. And then in the late 70s, it really becomes a battlefield. And that's when you had James Woodruff, for instance, at Harding University that wrote a book called The Divorce Dilemma. 1979, James Bales wrote the book Not Under Bondage. And then Thomas Warren, who came to our school in 1979, he wrote a book called Keeping the Lock in Wedlock, which was a response to Brother Bales. Now, back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, the writings on divorce and remarriage were basically articles, but now they're writing books. And these books are not the kind of books you can sit down with a bowl of popcorn and read. These are heavy-hitting books. Yeah. And so Brother Bales took the position that Matthew 19:9 only applies to 2 Christians, to 2 Christians. So you've got that battle, and so I came into the scene as a new Christian. I started school there in 1981. Brother Warren was there. He was writing this book at the time. Brother Deaver was involved in that. We had another teacher who had a public debate on this issue, another teacher that had a public debate on the issue of homosexuality. So I cut my teeth on this issue early, and I had to because this was being talked about, and you had to know some things about this. And I do remember one time that Brother Deaver came into class, and he came in with a smile. He usually told some kind of joke when he started the class, and so this time he said that he had received some mail, what we call snail mail today. It was the only mail that we had back in those days. But Brother Bales and he had been into a big discussion, a heated discussion about this, which led to a debate called the Bales-Deaver debate. It was a written debate, and it's in book form. But Brother Deaver came in and he said, I got this cartoon from Brother Bales. And he said the cartoon was a preacher standing in the pulpit, and he has on a full suit of medieval armor. So his body is completely covered from head to toe in medieval armor. And the caption has that preacher saying, "My sermon today is marriage, divorce, and remarriage." So it was beginning to be an issue that brethren feared. And so what happens is that I began to see a difference in how different preachers would approach that. Some would say, well, the non-Christians are not under the law of Christ, and so you've got those views. Others were saying, well, maybe we need to look at the word adultery. Maybe we've misunderstood what that is. Maybe when we're talking about who's amenable to the law of Christ, that's not really the issue, because if it's not sexual, if it's not ongoing, if it's a one-time act, then that changes the playing field completely. That changes the whole problem. You can just repent of it. Now, that's in the early 80s. So in 1982, Truman Scott had a debate with Wayne Jackson on that point, and Truman Scott upheld that view. So it was interesting to me, however, that James Bales rejected that. He specifically said that he didn't believe the point action or the aoristic kind of present argument. He said that just won't work. Right. But as the decade progressed, you find that in 1988, Rubel Shelley said that you don't even have to remarry. If you just get an unscriptural divorce, that is adultery.
Covenant breaking.
It's covenant breaking, yes. That's how they defined it. As you get into the 1990s, there were other debates about that. And so as you get past the new millennium, get into the 2000s, what I noticed, Don, was that it wasn't talked about as much. And I began to find that students who even had a master's degree from one of our universities knew very little about what I'm talking about. And that was about 2005, 2010. I began to get a little scared because I thought, they don't even know anything about the basic issues here.
Why do you think
what's
that
happened?
was?
I believe several reasons. I believe that you had this influx of teachers who were teaching all these false doctrines, and they kind of felt like that they won the battle, and so it was just ignored. And then you had local congregations who were not teaching on it anymore, and that created part of the problem. I believe also that the marriage, divorce, and remarriage arena of questions was eclipsed by something that we'd never had to deal with before, and that was the same-sex marriage issue. That got the attention. It's like running to the walls to defend the city. So you got people attacking on a divorce and remarriage here and over there, but here comes these tanks, and they're breaking through the walls with same-sex marriage, and so we've got to defend that. So post-COVID, let's go to post-COVID. Now, what I'm seeing is 45 plus years after I first started hearing about some of these views, and in particular the one that we're looking at today, the first time was 45 years ago. And I thought that it just disappeared, heard all those arguments before. None of this is new to Dave and myself, and maybe Don, to you as well. We've heard those things before, but I know that Dave and I go back a little further because, after all, we're a little older than you are. But we remember those things. And I kind of thought that maybe they've been laid to rest. Yeah. Maybe people had forgotten about them. Maybe people understood them. And now I find that there is a resurgence of the same arguments. And so when you informed me that these same kinds of views were being taught again, I thought, wow, I'm really getting older here, because I've seen a whole generation come and go, and we're going right back to the start.
I see some of the issues, not just about marriage and divorce, but some of the issues about instrumental music.
Yes.
It's the old issues that are just the old arguments are resurfacing. Yes. We thought we had beaten it down, but they're coming back again. Why? Because we stopped teaching about it.
That's right.
And notice that a lot of this is due to what we call the liberal movement. Churches of Christ have faced a major split. So that leftist element is mirroring a lot of the stuff that's going on in the world and trying to act like, hey, we love you, you can come here and everything's okay. So that kind of exacerbated the situation.
Dave, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the history of this in the Lord's Church, your experience. I know it was a hot issue when you were coming up.
I think Kerry has done an incredible job going all the way back, in American civilization, where divorce was almost unheard of. And it stayed that way for all through those years, really, except for the Roaring 20s. And then suddenly in the early 60s, its divorce rates skyrocketed. And sadly, the church has often mirrored society. And so a lot of the problems we're seeing, and it's interesting to me that that they would want to come up with these sophisticated arguments to try to justify. But we are now in a societal climate, and among the more liberal churches, I don't even think a lot of them feel the need to defend it, debate it, or argue it.
That's right.
I mean, it's acceptable,
That's right.
and if you don't, we accept people, and you don't.
That's right.
As we were preparing for this program, and I've been reading different literature, I have found about 6 different approaches that teach ways around Matthew 19 and verse 9. And some of them are very complex. You nearly have to be a Greek scholar to even understand some of these. But if we would just simply go back and do what we did at the beginning of this program and teach what the Bible says in very plain, straightforward language in Matthew 19:9, marriage is for a man and a woman for life. There's one exception to that, and that is fornication.
Don, I want to share something that has helped me a lot over the years. I'll go back about 43, 45 years ago, something like that. One of my teachers had debated this issue publicly, and he said something in class that really stuck with me more than just about anything else that I remember him saying about divorce and remarriage. He said, I've studied on this issue more than any issue that I have ever looked at. And he said, when I look at all these arguments, they're so complex, and the whole question gets so complicated sometimes that I get confused. And that caught my attention. I thought, I'm 22, 23 years old here. I'm just getting started. And if he feels that way, what about me? So that gave me some encouragement, but here's what he said.
Yeah.
He said, when I feel that way, I go back, and he said, I do just what you did, Don.
Yeah.
He said, I go back to Matthew 19, verse 9, and I just read it, and he said, it all becomes clear again.
Yeah.
God's word is powerful.
It's powerful.
The Lord's not trying to trick us, and
No.
He hasn't made the law on marriage so complicated that you've got to be a Greek scholar to know who you can marry.
That's right.
Now, 2 things I want to mention before we get into the discussion, and that is you have written a book, Kerry, called What God Rejoins, Studies in Divorce and Remarriage, and we have this book that is going to be available as a free digital download. We'll put the link below. It's also going to be on the GBN website. Can you tell us a word about the book?
That is a compilation of writings that I've done at that point when it was published for 35 years. So there are articles that deal with simple questions such as, why is fornication the one exception? Do the divorce papers have to say for adultery? Is adultery in the heart a reason for divorce remarriage? Those kinds of things. And so what happens is then it progresses into longer articles that get a little bit harder, and finally into a master's thesis that I wrote in 1988.
And the specific question that we're going to be talking about today, you've got a chapter in the book on that as well.
Several chapters deal with it, several sections deal with it, but one in particular especially deals with it, and it was due to a problem that an eldership approached me on years ago.
Okay. And Dave, you have written a little booklet, 71 pages, called Does Commits Adultery in Matthew 19:9 Refer to Continuous Action, which is directly the question we're going to talk about today. And it's also going to be available on the GBN website, and we'll provide the link for the download to that. Anything you'd like to say about that booklet?
Well, you caused it to be written by calling me and saying, hey, we need to talk about this. So that caused me to go back to and start studying and rethinking all the stuff from the 70s that I had played to rest in my mind back at that time. But now, as you say, it's reared its head, and so we've got to address it.
Okay. And that is the reason it directly relates to this, because I asked you to study that. All right. Let's get into our discussion for today's program. And this is relating to this video that's been done by Michael Heisaw. And I'm going to get Aaron to set this up for us.
Okay, so we did the Answer in the Error episode, and Mike responded to our video. And so what we want to do now is, I guess, just respond to his arguments. And what we're going to do is I'm going to try to do the best I can. I've watched Mike's video quite a few times to summarize his view, and then we're going to show a clip so that he can speak for himself. So the first part of his argument, maybe the first point, is essentially he takes the position that in Matthew 19:9, commits adultery, moikotai is the word. It's a verb. It's in the present tense indicative mood. And some will say that it's present tense, so it always means continuous. And of course, we all know that in the indicative mood, that's not always true, okay? And so he says it doesn't necessarily mean continuous action, but that it's always determined by context, which the argument's not wrong, But that's really the first point of his argument. So we're going to go ahead and play his clip, and we'll let him, make his own point for him, and then we'll discuss it.
Okay.
Present indicative verbs, do they always mean ongoing action, progressive action, and so must moikatai mean keeps on committing adultery? Well, the answer to that is no, definitely not. If you read Matthew's gospel in Greek from beginning to end, you're going to find lots of present indicative verbs that don't carry with them the idea of ongoing action. In fact, even in Matthew chapter 19:9, moikatai is not the first present indicative verb. The verse begins with a present indicative verb. When Jesus says, "But I say to you," or "and I say to you," it's lego, which is a present indicative verb. Does that mean that Jesus is progressively saying, or does it mean that he's saying then, at that time? Well, obviously it means he's saying then, at that time.
I want to begin and summarize Mike's view. Mike believes that if a man divorces his wife and remarries someone else, that act of divorcing and remarrying is adultery. That's how he defines adultery. But he says it doesn't continue to be adultery. He committed it only once, and so he can stay in that marriage with God's approval. That is his view. Now, to prove his view, he's going to make 4 points, and we just showed you the first one. To make it very simply, his first point to defend this view is Matthew 19:9. The phrase commits adultery is a present indicative verb, and he says that doesn't necessarily mean continuous action. How would you respond to that, Dave?
Well, I think he's correct about that. In other words, as Aaron pointed out, the other Greek moods, the present is pretty much linear. But in the present tense itself, there can be different types of present tenses, like the gnomic present or the historical present. There's a bunch of different ones notice that none of these are laid in concrete. These are just grammarians studying the language and trying to give names to what appears to be taking place.
Right.
And lexicographers can be wrong on things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that, to me, he's completely sidestepped the point. It doesn't matter whether it's punctiliar point action. It's in other words, a gnomic present is where you come in and look at event as just here, this is occurring. But the Greek is not in any way intending to imply that there was no activity before or after that. Right. You would have to look at other circumstances, context, remote context, what else the Bible say, because that's just not clarified there.
Right. Any thoughts about that, Kerry?
There is a tremendous overdependence on Greek and an overemphasis on Greek in the church, especially among preachers. And I have said this for 30 years, that 95% of the time, I'm not trying to be overly critical here, but 95% of the time when I read or I hear someone using Greek to prove a point, it was unnecessary. You could do the same thing with English. But somehow we've gotten into this mode where we think that we make the point more powerfully if we refer to a Greek rule or something like that. And we've got the situation in reverse, and we've got to start teaching better on this. When you think about the process here of how a Greek rule is formulated or concluded, it's not like this. It's not that the Greek rule determines the usage in the New Testament. It's that the usage in the New Testament as a whole determines the Greek rule. Well, we got that in reverse. Because the first thing that many times we want to do when we look at a controversial issue is, what does the Greek say? And then the next step is, what do the Greek scholars say? What do the Greek authorities say? And I really appreciate what Davis said. We're talking about people here who don't believe in baptism for the remission of sins most of the time. They can't even get it right on that. They're wrong on any number of things. And the more you read them, the more you see that when it comes to actually interpreting the text, that they're sometimes above average in their interpretational skills, but they're certainly not experts in that. There's a different mindset involved in dealing with particular nuances in Greek and the translational process than there is in interpreting and applying the scriptures. It's a different mindset. There's a different set of skills involved, and it's really hard to get that across, very hard to get that across. So when it comes to the present tense, you don't want to make the argument, as Dave and Aaron have well stated, you don't want to state the argument that the present tense always means that it's ongoing, that it's always repetitive. But that doesn't automatically mean that it's point action. The issue, as you've already stated, Don, you said that the issue is not that at all. The issue is, what is the meaning of adultery? Right. Not the time, but what is the idea? What is the concept involved in it? And once you do that, right, if the adultery is sexual, then the matter is laid to rest. And when we say context, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we're not done with this yet. We're just getting started on this. Yeah. And we're trying to be very careful in this, not to overdo it on the Greek terms. As far as the Greek terms are concerned, here's the Greek Testament, and I can read that, but what good is that going to do? Right. I mean, for most of the hearers, and the point that I'm trying to make is that what the Greek says in Matthew chapter 19:9 is not any different from what it says here in the end. And think of it in this way. What language was the New Testament written in? It is called Koine Greek. And Koine means what? That's the common, yes. Mark 12:37, the common people heard him gladly. Now, I'm not identifying the word there. I'm just trying to say that in the first century, when Paul preached, you didn't have, let's say, Aristarchus over here saying to Titus over there, hey, you know what? He used an imperfect there. He didn't use an aorist. So there must be something to that. Oh, but Titus says, no, but you have to understand there's a difference between the subjunctive, which he used, and the indicative, which he did not use. And so you've missed that completely. And you have another. That's not how you communicate.
Well, and I just want to, I am sitting here too, with the voice of the objector, because I've heard this argument before where someone will say, well, if you can't prove it in the Greek, you're going to run from the Greek. Now, maybe if someone like me who's inexperienced made that argument, but you've been teaching Greek and you've been studying Greek for years. Yeah. And so I think the thing that does it for me that we've had just in casual conversation is when you show the examples, yeah. Because, I've looked at tons of grammars. We gave Mike a list, and Mike actually looked at the list that we gave, and with the exception of one, he said, no, I understand from these grammars why you came to the position that it's, more the sort of the rule. I even hate to say that, right? Right. But the majority is ongoing. But the thing, what I've learned from studying with you and listening to other guys is that it's always context. Some they use the fancy German word Actionsart, which means sort of action, right? That word confused me for so long. Like, what does this mean? But it's always, hey, this in the indicative present can mean point. It can mean continuous, but the only way to figure that out is looking at the context.
Yes. Yeah. The actual uses of the verb or the noun or whatever it is. It took me 10 or 15 years of making some mistakes like that, where I just depended on the Greek so much. I just went to the lexicons, I went to the grammars and things like that, until actually about 1990. By the way, when it comes to Greek and Hebrew in Churches of Christ, we're about 30 years behind on this point that I'm about to make here. There was a shift about 35 years ago in the Protestant circles about the overemphasis on Greek and Hebrew, and how that we have made Greek and Hebrew into languages that communicate in ways that they were never intended to communicate. Concepts. You don't do that with a subtle nuance or a subtle change in tense and so forth. And so what happened to me was, in my progression through this, was that I began to ask the question, okay, A.T. Robertson is a great Greek scholar. Mm-hmm. And I began to ask the question, okay, first of all, he doesn't even understand Acts 2:38, and he chopped it to pieces. And I don't have to know anything about Greek to know that.
And A.T. Robertson said, you'll determine your theology on Acts 2. You'll determine what Acts 2:38 means based on your theology.
Yes.
But he had no problem in Matthew 26:28. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it shows you that the theological bias even, it filters into the most, well-respected.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah. What I began to ask myself was, where did they get their information? In other words, how did they arrive at this rule? They did that by looking at instances of the usage of that verb, noun, phrase, whatever it is, in the New Testament. That requires simple interpretation of New Testament passages. Well, anybody can do that. You know, Carol Osborne, who's been quoted by the speaker on this video, went through a list of verses in the New Testament where he said, here's the present tense, and it doesn't refer to something that is continuous and something that is repetitive. And one of the first verses he mentioned was Matthew 3:11, where John the Baptist said, I indeed baptize you with water. And he said, that's not necessarily repetitive. Well, all Jerusalem came to hear him, and he was baptizing people right and left. That's not repetitive. Now, you don't have to know anything about it to know that. So what I remember reading years ago in a book on logic by Lionel Ruby was that he said that dictionaries and grammarians are historians, not lawgivers. But we have, unintentionally, elevated them to the standpoint or to the position of being lawmakers almost, because we use these words, well, he's a Greek authority. What do you mean by that? He is an observer. He is an observer. He is a historian. And more than I ever realized in the first 10 or 15 years of my studies, the Greek grammarians are commentators. So that means whenever they talk about these verses and these usages, you need to test them by reading the scriptures yourself.
One thing, a point I want to make about this, Aaron, you spoke with Mike, and Mike said that he got his view from Dr. Carol Osborne, right?
Yeah, I think he said that's what essentially changed his mind, was he read Carol Osborne.
Dr. Carol Osborne wrote an article and has also done some Q&A. You can find it online. We can provide the links. But basically, he argues that in Matthew 19:9, if a man divorces his wife, except it be for fornication, and marries another, he commits adultery. Commits adultery is present indicative. He says that the phrase there, commits adultery, moikatai, is a gnomic present. In other words, it's just a general truth. And then he goes on to say over and over and over in the article, you can't tell whether it's a one-time action or ongoing from the grammar. He says you just can't tell. I think that's very important because Mike has carried this further, and Mike has said this is punctiliar. He says that this is a gnomic present. It's a one-time action. And Carol Osborne does not do that. Carol Osborne, I've got 4 quotes from the article where he says it's a gnomic simply means it's a general statement of truth. He says this is a general statement of truth, but he says you cannot tell whether it's durative, ongoing, or whether it's a one-time action. I think it's very important that we make that point.
And he explicitly says at least twice, context has to determine.
That's right. And that's going to become very important. So if I'm going to summarize this in very, very simple terms, Mike is trying to prove his position, and the first point is commits adultery. He says doesn't necessarily mean continuous action. And we all agree with that, right?
That's right.
We would agree that you have to determine it from the context.
Yes.
All right, Aaron, you want to set up the second one?
Yeah, that's great. So in the second one, he's going to move to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 32, and we'll show a clip here in a minute. But essentially, he's going to say, in Matthew 19:9a, or the first clause, whoever divorces his wife, except for fornication, and marries another, commits adultery. And that's present indicative, all right? So we just discussed. He's going to connect Matthew 5:32, the first clause, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except fornication causes her to commit adultery. And he's going to say, okay, it was present indicative, commits adultery in Matthew 19:9. Matthew 5:32, it is now aorist passive infinitive. And so what he's basically saying is he's making a parallel between Matthew 19:9, commits adultery, Matthew 5:32, commits adultery. One is present indicative, which he says can be point in action. He's going to parallel that with Matthew 5:32, which is aorist passive infinitive. And like we said, we know this is getting in the weeds a little bit, but you're probably asleep or turn the video off if we haven't lost you already, right? And so we'll go ahead and play his clip, and then we'll discuss that as well. So, okay.
But here's a second reason why I believe that's the case. It's because that verb moikatai, the action of that verb moikatai, is parallel in Matthew 5 verse 32 to the action of an aorist passive infinitive, moikuthenai. Now, Back to Matthew 5:32. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 32, that whoever divorces his wife, saving for the cause of sexual immorality, makes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman, or I think the idea is a woman so divorced, commits adultery. All right, so that phrase, makes her to commit adultery, is poie autein moikuthenai. Now, that word, moikuthenai, is an aorist passive infinitive. And the action of an aorist infinitive is undefined. If Jesus really had wanted to communicate this idea that the woman in remarrying enters into an ongoing state of adultery, the verb to use is not an aorist passive infinitive. The verb to use would be a present passive infinitive. What Jesus would have said is moiku esthai, poie autein moiku esthai.
All right, so in this clip, 1205 to 1338 in this video, Mike essentially is comparing the aorist infinitive, passive infinitive in the first clause of Matthew 5:32, and basically says it's paralleled with Matthew 19:9, the indicative present, okay? And so essentially the argument is that the aorist infinitive is paralleled with the present indicative. Now, Kerry, I'm going to throw this one to you, but my understanding, and as Mike actually stated, that the aorist passive infinitive does not actually denote time. It's once again, just like the present indicative, it's all based on context. So, I mean, that's my understanding of it from some grammars that I have. How would you respond to this argument?
He says that if Jesus had wanted to say, if he'd wanted to express the idea of ongoing action, he would have used the present active infinitive. Now, the belief of he, Osborne, and several other grammarians is that the present active indicative always, most of them will get close to that, if not saying that it does denote ongoing action. So I know this is a subtle distinction here. What they're saying is if it's a present active indicative verb, if it's a verb in the present tense, it may be one time or it may be many. An infinitive is not a verb, technically, so we're in a different category here. So the aorist infinitive may or may not involve ongoing action or point action. It's just a snapshot. But what he's saying is, and he's got several grammarians that will back him up on this, that the present infinitive does denote ongoing action. And if Jesus had meant to say that the adultery is ongoing rather than one time, he would have used the present infinitive. Now, here's what I'm talking about. Here's what I mentioned a minute ago. That sounds like a technical, it sounds like a very intelligent rule until you put it to the test in the New Testament. So here's a very simple way here. You don't have to know anything about Greek. All right. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 9, I'm looking at it here in English. I've got the Greek right here open, but I'm going to read it in English. It is better to marry than to burn. Everybody remember that. It's better to marry than to burn. Now, to marry there is an aorist infinitive, just like Matthew 5:32. Better to marry than to burn. So I wouldn't argue that that's ongoing. I would simply say, look, it's better to marry. You do that one time. Mm-hmm. But when you look at what Paul also wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14, this is where it gets very interesting. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14, Paul said, "Therefore I desire, or I will, that the younger widows marry." Mm-hmm. Now, in the Greek, that is the infinitive. Yeah. That's the infinitive form. Yeah. Guess what it is?
It's present.
That's the present infinitive, which the video and the so-called scholars say that is ongoing action. Can't be. Can't be. In other words, the aorist infinitive in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 9, means the same thing, has the same time of action, the same kind of action as the present infinitive in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14. So what happens to the rule now? This is what happens. I have seen this so many times. I would think, well, I've got a good argument. Years ago, I got a good argument because the Greek means this and it means that. And then 2 years later, I would find an exception to that rule, and I thought, why do I keep falling for this? You know, they're giving comments, they're giving general rules, which we really ought to call general principles of usage. And this is just one here. And I do want to come back to that also, because it does, those verses I just looked at do have a strong statement to make about the nature of adultery, and it's not a one-time act. So if I could come back later,
Sure.
John, and talk about
absolutely.
that.
So what I just saw there is the argument of, hey, Jesus used an aorist infinitive. If he wanted to say it was ongoing, he would have used present. And you just showed two passages that are talking about the exact same action,
right.
marriage, and that one uses the aorist and one uses the present.
That's right.
And he also implied that if he wanted to say this, he would have used the perfect. Well, he could have, but you don't have to do it that way.
Yeah,
So once again, you're trying to impose kind of a prejudice onto the text.
Right. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. That's
All right,
interesting.
let's go to his third argument. Aaron, if you'll explain that and play the clip for us.
Okay.
But in the third place, if Jesus would have wanted to communicate the idea that this remarriage is an ongoing state of adultery, he could have done that very easily linguistically. All he would have had to do is to put that verb in Matthew 19, verse 9, moikao, is to put it in the perfect tense. All he would have had to say is, me moi ketai. You know, whoever divorces his wife except to be for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, enters into a state of adultery, me moi ketai. If he just would have put it in the perfect tense.
All right, so in this third argument that Mike uses, he essentially goes back to Matthew 19:9, and he says that if Jesus wanted to communicate that the ongoing remarriage was adulterous, he would have used a different word. He would have made moikatai the perfect passive form to show continuous action. How would you respond to that, Kerry?
Well, in the first place, when you get into translating in the Greek New Testament, you start out with, usually in learning Greek, you start out with a grammar book, you know, like Summers or Mounts or something like that. And you start out translating simple sentences. And I've noticed that students sometimes are shocked when they get into maybe second-year Greek or third-year Greek, and they're translating from the Greek New Testament. You do some of that in the first-year Greek. But they will oftentimes say to me, well, I thought you said this, or I thought the book said that. You know, what was the rule that we studied? This is different. Well, the rule is a general guideline. It's a basic principle. It's not an ironclad universal rule that fits every situation, but that's very difficult to get across. So in this case, what I'm saying is that the perfect tense is something different than what we have in English. The perfect tense in Greek means that an action has been completed and the results remain from that action, and the emphasis is on the abiding or the continuing results. So it's a little bit different from just a past tense. It's different from the aorist. It's different from the imperfect, which is a past tense in the Greek. But how do you translate that into English? It's kind of difficult. For instance, when Jesus says to the devil, "It is written," that sounds like present tense, right? But it's actually perfect. It means it has been written. But if you're going to put the emphasis on the results that remain, which the King James Version translators and others do, then you say it is written. If you want to fully state it, you would have to say it has been written and it stands written. But that's a little laborious, you know. So most of them just translate it just as a simple English present tense. So that being the case, it's easy for the speaker in the video to say, well, you know, if Jesus wanted to say this, he would use the present instead of the perfect. When you do exercises in translating sentences from the Greek New Testament, you find that the distinction there is not always a wall. Sometimes they bleed over. And so these are, and Brother Dave put this very well a minute ago. We're talking about grammar books that were written 18 and 1900 years after the New Testament was written, and they label these things. And we get so caught up with the labels that we forget the beauty of how the language worked and was understood by the common man. And so I would simply say that, again, is just what we said about the aorist infinitive. That is pure speculation. That is nothing but conjecture on his point to say, well, if he wanted to say this, then he would have said it this way. That it's impossible to prove that.
And one thing that I think I mentioned to you one time in a previous conversation is I love to read the early church fathers who all ate, slept, spoke Greek.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I mentioned this to you once. I said, what's really interesting to me? I never, ever see them make an argument from the grammar. And I'm not saying there's never a place for it, but it's interesting to me that all these guys that spoke Greek as their native language never made these arguments,
That's very interesting, and you bring that up to the Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
Calvin and Luther were not dummies when it came to Greek and Hebrew.
Yeah.
Those guys were very educated. They knew what they were doing with the languages. I'm not saying that we would agree with what they said, but as far as linguistic abilities are concerned, they had tremendous understanding of it. But you go back and you read Luther and you read Calvin, you read Calvin's Institutes, it's rare that you ever find him saying anything grammatically to prove his point of his system of Calvinism. Now, you would think that if it's necessary or if it adds weight, that a guy like Calvin would do that, but he doesn't. And so we are in a phase of church history right now about this has been in motion for about 100, maybe 150, maybe 200 years. I think it came from a lot of German rationalism back in the 1800s, but it has affected New Testament exegesis to this day. But we're in a period of church history right now where there is this overemphasis on an overinterpretation of Greek and Hebrew. I don't know any other way to say that. That is unlike what we saw for the previous 18 or 1900 years. But we're in that now, and we've got all these programs now. We got grammars, a mile high, and got lexicographers and so forth, and those are good if you use them sparingly. But like commentaries, they're oftentimes overused. And so I don't know how much longer this is going to last. But if we could just make a projection out there, this can't go on like this. There was like I said, there was a turn. There was a shift back in about 1990, and I've got an article here from a teacher in a seminary that states that, we turned the corner on this about 35 years ago. We saw that we need to get more common sense into Bible interpretation, use of the Greek and Hebrew. But there was a book written by Moises Silva entitled God, Language, and Scripture that I read about that same time, and I thought, he's saying what I've been thinking, but he's saying it much better than I could ever say it, and he's right about this. Just use some common sense about it. And what I'm saying about the future is it may be 200 years from now, if anybody listens to our podcast, if anybody reads what we have written, that they're going to chuckle a little bit and say, well, that's all they talked about was every little tense and every little jot and tittle, and they wasted a lot of time on that. We've moved past that. I'm not sure, but I do know that there's just an overemphasis on it.
Well, if you think through that, you don't have to know what baptizo means in order to know that the Bible teaches that you have to be immersed before you can contact the blood of Christ.
That's right.
You don't have to understand the meaning of the phrase on the first day of the week and it being Saturday night and all. You don't have to understand all that to know that the New Testament teaches that first century Christians partook of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. And you don't have to know Greek to know what adultery is.
That's right.
And both of those things, so help me out here. I understand, I think, if I'm understanding the argument, he says if Jesus wanted to say that the marriage was this continuing state of adultery, he would have used the perfect tense. Is that maybe putting more focus, or maybe that can bring us to actually discussing, I don't know if this is the next point, what is the word fornication, what is the word adultery, adultery.
Yeah, you would have to get back to that, but the perfect tense wouldn't help him out on that at all, because the perfect tense means that the action has ended and, it goes on.
So once again, it's context determines the usage, yeah.
I agree with and appreciate everything that you're saying. But as we get a little bit further, this is really getting into the weeds, but I believe that this is a grammatical smokescreen. Mm-hmm. I think what we're going to see when we get into the context and we see biblical examples, we're going to see and understand what adultery is. We're going to see what marriage is, and it's going to make it simple so that the average man can understand it. And this is just a lot of smoke to lead people from what the true biblical teaching of Matthew 19:9 is.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
All right. Well, we've been talking about some very serious and sobering things today. Maybe you have some questions about them and you'd like to reach out to us at the Gospel Broadcasting Network. If we can help, we would love to do that. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Answering the Error.
Thank you for tuning in for part 1 of this episode of Answering the Error. Join us back next time where we continue our discussion on marriage, divorce, and remarriage.